The Pacific Ocean, August 1788. Two majestic French frigates, La Boussole and l'Astrolabe, glide through waters that European maps still label as empty. On board, 225 men, the scientific and naval elite of France, are completing what should be the final leg of a 4-year expedition that has redefined the boundaries of human knowledge. They have charted unexplored coasts from Alaska to Chile, established diplomatic relations with indigenous peoples from the Americas to Asia, and collected specimens that have doubled Europe's understanding of the natural history of the Pacific. Their commander, Jean-François de La Pérouse, Count of La Pérouse, is the mind behind this perfectly orchestrated operation, a man whose reputation as a navigator is surpassed only by his devotion to the humanist ideals of the Enlightenment. Just 6 months earlier, in March 1788, they had a civilized encounter at Botany Bay with the British of the First Fleet, their geopolitical rivals. There, La Pérouse entrusted his enemies with his most precious treasure, all the journals, maps, and discoveries gathered over 3 years of travel, ensuring that his scientific legacy would survive, even if he and his men did not. It was the final act of a methodical, cautious man who had planned every detail to minimize risk. They sailed north from Australia into waters marked by cartographers with the ominous phrase terra incognita. And then, silence. No distress call, no floating debris, not a single survivor. 225 of France's brightest minds, along with scientific equipment worth millions in today's currency, simply vanished from history. What followed became one of the most enduring maritime mysteries of all time, magnified by a cruel twist of fate. Their disappearance coincided with France's descent into the chaos of revolution, ensuring that any rescue would come far too late, if it ever came at all. For 40 years, the fate of La Pérouse would become the holy grail of maritime exploration, a riddle that would draw treasure hunters, historians, and archaeologists across centuries. The question that echoed through generations was both simple and profound. How could the best equipped, most carefully planned expedition of the 18th century vanish without a trace? The answer, one that would begin to surface only in the 21st century through underwater forensic archaeology, would reveal a tragedy of cascading errors, survival against all odds, and ultimately, nature's triumph over human arrogance. This is the story of how Enlightenment ambition collided with the merciless reality of the Pacific, and how the wreck of 2 ships became the symbol of an entire era's shipwreck. But to grasp the true magnitude of this loss, we must begin not at sea, but in the gilded halls of Versailles, where a king on the brink of financial ruin wagered his nation's prestige in one final desperate bid for scientific glory. Versailles, 1785. The French court still breathes the fading air of the old regime as King Louis XVI, monarch of a nation teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, approves one of the most ambitious and expensive projects of his reign. The La Pérouse expedition is not merely a voyage of exploration, it is the dying monarchy's last great gamble to secure its place in history. France, recently humiliated by Britain in the 7 Years' War and still smarting from the loss of its North American colonies, sees in this expedition a chance to restore its international prestige. The king personally oversees the preparations, obsessed with surpassing the legacy of Captain James Cook, whose name dominates the maps of the Pacific. Royal archives reveal that Louis XVI invested more than 1 million livres tournois, roughly equivalent to 50 million euros today, to outfit the 2 frigates. This astronomical figure was approved even as the nation faced an unprecedented fiscal crisis, with peasants starving and the nobility refusing to pay taxes. The irony is stark. The expedition meant to find new wealth for France would depart from a country bleeding economically. The goals were multiple and audacious: to complete the mapping of the Pacific, to seek the legendary Northwest Passage, to establish trade with Japan and China, and above all, to demonstrate French scientific supremacy. The king personally drafted a 42-page document of instructions for La Pérouse, blending meticulous scientific directives with humanistic principles that were revolutionary for the time. "Treat the natives with humanity and respect," ordered the monarch, words reflecting the Enlightenment ideals that would soon turn against his own throne. The expedition was conceived as a purely scientific mission, free of overt colonial aggression, though it would inevitably identify potential sites for future French expansion. In the shipyards of Brest, as carpenters worked day and night adapting the frigates for their transoceanic journey, political tension in Paris was reaching a boiling point. The very philosophers whose ideas inspired the scientific spirit of the mission, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, were laying the intellectual groundwork that would topple the monarchy. La Pérouse, aware of these tensions, hurried to set sail before financial turmoil could cancel the voyage. When the two ships finally departed on August 1st, 1785, they carried not only France's scientific ambitions, but also the last breath of legitimacy of a doomed regime. Louis VI had staked his royal prestige on this expedition, unaware that his fate would forever be intertwined with that of La Pérouse. As the sails vanished over the horizon, the king remarked to his courtiers, "I hope this voyage brings glory to France." He could not imagine that it would become the monarchy's final great endeavour, nor that his own political downfall would condemn the expedition to oblivion at the very moment it needed rescue. Tragedy was already underway, not only on distant seas, but within the gilded halls where the fate of a nation was being sealed. Jean-François de Galaup, Count of La Pérouse at 44, embodied the Enlightenment ideal in its purest form. A soldier with a scientific mind, an aristocrat with humanist sensitivity, a navigator who valued knowledge above conquest. Born in 1741 near Albi, he entered the Royal Navy at the age of 15, earning distinction during the 7 Years' War and later in operations against the British in North America. What set La Pérouse apart from his contemporaries, however, was his insatiable intellectual curiosity and his genuine respect for the cultures he encountered. When Louis XVI selected him to lead the expedition, he wasn't merely appointing an experienced seaman, he was choosing a diplomat and a natural scientist. Historical records show that La Pérouse spent months meticulously preparing for the voyage. He consulted France's leading scholars, studied Cook's reports, and personally selected each member of the scientific crew. His correspondence reveals a man obsessed with detail, from the quality of the experimental canned food they would carry to the protocols for interacting with indigenous peoples. "We must approach them not as conquerors, but as brothers," he wrote in his crew instructions. That philosophy would be tested repeatedly during the expedition, most notably when he personally intervened to prevent retaliation after Samoan islanders killed 12 of his men. He argued that their mistrust of foreigners was understandable. La Pérouse was, in many ways, a man ahead of his time. While most European explorers viewed native populations as savages to be civilized, he studied them with genuine anthropological interest, carefully recording their customs, languages, and social structures. His journals, preserved thanks to the reports sent from Australia, contain some of the most valuable and respectful ethnographic observations of the 18th century. Yet behind this enlightened facade beat the heart of a disciplined officer who did not tolerate incompetence. Ship logs show he enforced naval discipline with a firm but fair hand. This rare blend of military rigor and humanist empathy made him the ideal commander for a mission balancing scientific inquiry with high-risk navigation. When he sailed from Brest, La Pérouse carried not only the ambitions of his king, but also the noblest ideals of his age. He knew his expedition might redefine Europe's understanding of the world, and he accepted that burden with a mix of pride and humility that was distinctly his own. In a letter to his wife, written just before departure, he reflected, "I hope our voyage serves not only to expand the maps, but to expand understanding among peoples." That vision, so progressive for its time, would make his disappearance not merely a nautical tragedy, but an intellectual loss of immeasurable magnitude. La Pérouse was not simply another explorer in search of glory. He was an ambassador of the Enlightenment, carrying its ideals to the farthest corners of the earth. His premature silencing marked the end of a vision of exploration, one rooted in mutual understanding rather than domination. The frigates La Boussole and l'Astrolabe were not mere vessels of exploration. They were the most advanced scientific laboratories ever to sail the oceans. Each displaced roughly 500 tons and measured 41 meters in length, impressive dimensions for their time, concealing a revolution within their design. French naval engineers had transformed these warships into floating research centers, sacrificing artillery capacity in favor of space for science. Where other ships carried cannons, La Boussole and l'Astrolabe carried specialized libraries with more than 500 volumes, the latest works in astronomy, botany, and navigation. The surviving inventories reveal the extraordinary sophistication of their equipment. Precision marine chronometers built by the legendary watchmaker Ferdinand Berthoud, capable of keeping time within a margin of mere seconds per month. Sextants and octants from the Maison Langlois of Paris, instruments that allowed navigators to determine their position with unprecedented accuracy. Mercury barometers to predict storms, maximum-minimum thermometers to record climate variations, and even an innovative still for converting seawater into fresh water. Perhaps most impressive was their collection of instruments for biological and ethnographic research. Presses for botanical specimens, glass jars for preserving samples in alcohol, fine watercolor sets and high-grade paper for scientific illustrations, and a camera obscura for capturing coastal landscapes with topographical precision. Each ship functioned as a self-sufficient scientific institution, equipped with repair workshops, onboard forges for manufacturing spare parts, and even a small printing press for producing copies of maps and key documents. The crew included specialists trained to maintain this cutting-edge equipment, from clockmakers to optical technicians. Yet this dependence on the most advanced technology of the 18th century would prove both their greatest strength and their potential vulnerability. The instruments, though revolutionary, were delicate and required constant maintenance under harsh maritime conditions. The chronometers, essential for precision navigation, could easily lose calibration due to rough seas or temperature changes. Telescopes and sextants required regular adjustment. The expedition represented the pinnacle of 18th century science, but also its greatest gamble. When the frigates sailed from Brest, they carried not only France's hopes, but the tangible proof that European science could master the remotest oceans. However, that same faith in technology may have fostered a dangerous illusion of safety, leading La Pérouse to venture into perilous waters with the conviction that his instruments could shield him from the hazards that had destroyed less equipped sailors. The paradox was clear. The more advanced the technology, the greater the temptation to take risks that earlier mariners would have deemed reckless. The crew of 225 men chosen for the expedition represented an unprecedented concentration of scientific talent in the history of naval exploration. This was not merely a group of seasoned sailors, but a true floating university, where every specialist was a master in his field. The scientific corps consisted of 10 first-rate scholars, including Joseph Lepaute d'Aguillet, royal astronomer and member of the Academy of Sciences, responsible for celestial observations and the verification of chronometers; Robert de Lamennais, naturalist and geologist who had studied under the most eminent scientists in Paris; and botanist Jean-Nicolas Collignon, tasked with collecting and classifying plant species. Completing the team were a chief cartographer, 3 draughtsmen specializing in landscapes, architecture, and ethnographic portraits, and 3 additional naturalists focused on terrestrial and marine fauna. The ship manifests reveal that each scientist carried specialized instruments. D'Aguillet brought state-of-the-art reflecting telescopes for astronomical study. Lamennais carried geological hammers, magnifying lenses, and chemical reagents for mineral analysis. Collignon had microscopes for studying the cellular structure of plants. But the innovation did not end there. For the first time in history, the expedition included a professional linguist, Father Jean-Louis Receveur, whose mission was to document and analyze the languages of the peoples they encountered. The naval officers themselves were educated men, trained additionally in natural sciences and observational techniques. Even the ordinary sailors were selected for specific skills: carpenters able to build shelters and repair small boats, blacksmiths to maintain the equipment, and bakers experienced in food preservation. La Pérouse had insisted that every member of the expedition, regardless of rank, receive basic training in first aid and survival techniques. This extraordinary composition made the frigates something unique. They did not merely carry scientists. The entire enterprise was infused with scientific spirit. Daily routines included coordinated observation sessions where sailors and scholars worked side by side, collecting meteorological data, water samples, and current measurements. The draughtsmen documented every new animal or plant species with meticulous illustrations, while the naturalists dissected and preserved specimens. The ethnographers conducted structured interviews with indigenous leaders using standardized questionnaires developed by the French Academy. This methodical data collection would yield some of the most valuable records of the 18th century concerning the Pacific and its peoples, though much of it would vanish forever at Vanikoro. The tragedy of the expedition was not only the loss of human lives, but the disappearance of a priceless scientific archive that could have transformed Europe's understanding of the world. Can you imagine being part of an expedition like that? Today, even if we no longer sail on 18th century frigates, we can all be explorers of knowledge. What corner of the world would you like to see documented with that same level of scientific detail? The first 2 years of the expedition were an overwhelming success, far surpassing all expectations. After setting sail from Brest in August of 1785, La Boussole and l'Astrolabe began a meticulously documented voyage that would take them to some of the most remote corners of the planet. Their first major stop was the island of Santa Catarina, Brazil, where the naturalists collected hundreds of specimens of tropical flora and fauna, including species previously unknown to European science. From there, they sailed south, rounding Cape Horn under extreme weather conditions that tested both the endurance of the frigates and the skill of their crews. In February of 1786, they reached Concepcion, Chile, where they carried out crucial astronomical observations to verify longitude, while also establishing cordial relations with Spanish authorities and the local population. La Pérouse's journals praised Chilean hospitality and record cultural exchanges that ranged from agricultural techniques to indigenous medicinal knowledge. The next stage took them to the North Pacific, where they achieved one of their most significant cartographic accomplishments, the detailed mapping of the northwest coast of America, from present-day Oregon to Alaska. In Lituya Bay, Alaska, the scientists documented the culture of the Tlingit people, producing the first serious ethnographic studies of the region. The artists of the expedition created illustrations that captured, with extraordinary precision, the dwellings, canoes, clothing, and artifacts of this people, an invaluable record that would survive the expedition's tragic end. Later, the expedition headed south, visiting the Spanish mission in Monterey, California, in September of 1786. There, Collignon and the other naturalists gathered extensive samples of the local flora, while the cartographers produced coastal maps of exceptional accuracy. Following the humanist instructions of King Louis XVI, La Pérouse criticized in his reports the treatment that the Spanish gave to Native Americans, showing a moral sensibility uncommon among explorers of his time. The journey continued across the Pacific, with stops in Macau and Manila, where the expedition resupplied, and the scientists had the opportunity to study Chinese and Filipino trading cultures. In April of 1787, they reached the coast of Korea, becoming the first Westerners to chart parts of its shoreline in detail. They later explored the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin, resolving long-standing geographical questions that had puzzled European cartographers for decades. At every stop, the procedure was the same: astronomical observations to determine precise positions, collection of natural specimens, ethnographic documentation, and the establishment of diplomatic relations. The reports La Pérouse regularly sent back to France caused a sensation at the Academy of Sciences, confirming that the expedition was fulfilling, and even exceeding, its scientific goals. When the frigates reached the Russian colony of Petropavlovsk in Siberia in September of 1787, success seemed assured. From there, La Pérouse dispatched one of his officers, Jean-Baptiste de Lesseps, overland to Paris, carrying all the documents gathered so far, ensuring that at least part of the expedition's knowledge would survive. Lesseps undertook an epic one-year journey across Siberia and Russia, finally arriving in Versailles in October of 1788 with the scientific treasures of the expedition's first 2 years. This providential delivery preserved a significant portion of La Pérouse's legacy, but it also marked the point from which the expedition would venture into the unknown toward its final fate. January of 1788 marked the expedition's most extraordinary encounter and the prelude to its disappearance. When La Boussole and l'Astrolabe arrived at Botany Bay, Australia, they encountered a scene that encapsulated the complexities of 18th-century geopolitical rivalry. The British First Fleet, commanded by Captain Arthur Phillip, had just established the first European penal colony in Australia. The irony was profound. The French, representatives of the most enlightened monarchy, arrived with scientists and artists. The British, their historic rivals, were establishing a colony with convicts. Despite the political tensions between their nations, the encounter was remarkably civilized. Philip offered La Pérouse all the assistance he might need, including provisions and access to the limited resources of the fledgling colony. The French, in turn, shared valuable cartographic information about the Pacific islands they had explored. For 6 weeks, the two expeditions coexisted in the bay, exchanging knowledge and experiences. The French scientists studied Australia's unique flora and fauna, adding hundreds of new species to their collections. The artists documented the landscape and the Aboriginal inhabitants, producing some of the first detailed depictions of the Sydney region. But the crucial moment came when La Pérouse made a decision that would prove providential. He entrusted the British with all the journals, maps, nautical charts, and scientific documents accumulated since departing Kamchatka. This act of faith in his political rivals ensured that at least a significant portion of the expedition's work would reach Europe. The documents travelled aboard a British ship to London, from where they were sent on to Paris, arriving in the spring of 1789, just as the French Revolution erupted. As they prepared to depart, the French witnessed the challenges facing the British colony: food shortages, tensions with indigenous peoples, and the difficulties of establishing a permanent European presence in this remote territory. On the 10th of March, 1788, after loading provisions for several months, La Pérouse gave the order to weigh anchor. His plans, communicated to Philip, were to sail north to explore the Santa Cruz Islands, then head to Isle de France, modern Mauritius, and finally return to France by circumnavigating the Cape of Good Hope. British witnesses described the French frigate's departure under favourable winds, sailing gracefully north along the Australian coast. It was the last time Europeans would see La Pérouse and his men alive. The final irony lay in the contrast of destinies. The British, despite their numerous early hardships, would establish a permanent colony that became modern Australia. The French, seemingly better equipped and prepared, would vanish without a trace. Botany Bay thus became a historical turning point, not only as the site of Australia's founding, but also as the last confirmed link in the chain of one of the greatest tragedies in maritime exploration. The documents La Pérouse entrusted to his British enemies would become his scientific testament, the only tangible legacy of an expedition destined for glory, but condemned to mystery. The disappearance of La Pérouse was not immediately evident. In 1788, transoceanic communications depended on chance encounters with other ships and stops at known ports. The expedition had planned an itinerary of approximately 2 years from its departure from Botany Bay to its return to France, with multiple points where news could be sent. The first signs that something was wrong emerged slowly. By late 1789, when the expedition should have reached Isle de France, Mauritius, there was no trace of the frigates. By 1790, concern began to grow within French naval circles, but national attention was completely absorbed by revolutionary events. The storming of the Bastille in July of 1789 had marked the beginning of a political upheaval that would consume all of France's energies. The National Assembly, faced with financial crises, social tensions, and the threat of war with other European powers, had little time to devote to a distant naval expedition. Yet the memory of La Pérouse and his men was not entirely lost. The scientists who had followed the expedition's progress pressed for a search mission to be organized. Astronomer Jérôme Lalande, who had trained many of the expedition's scientists, argued tirelessly before the assembly about the importance of rescuing not only the men, but the scientific knowledge they carried. Finally, in 1791, 3 years after the disappearance, the National Assembly authorized a rescue expedition under the command of Antoine Bruni d'Entrecasteaux. This delay would prove fatal for any possibility of finding survivors. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, rumors and fragments of evidence began to surface. Russian fur traders reported unconfirmed sightings of European ships in the Solomon Islands. American whalers mentioned encounters with natives possessing metal artifacts of European origin. A British captain claimed to have seen wreckage along the coasts of New Caledonia. But these clues were vague, contradictory, and barely verifiable, given the vastness of the Pacific and the communication limitations of the time. Silence spread like a shroud over the fate of 225 men. In France, revolutionary chaos intensified. Louis XVI, the original patron of the expedition, was arrested in 1792 and executed in January of 1793. Many of the nobles and academics who had supported the expedition were guillotined or fled the country. Naval records were scattered or destroyed during the Terror. The La Pérouse expedition, once the pride of the monarchy, became an uncomfortable symbol of the Ancien regime in a revolutionary France eager to erase all traces of its royal past. The silence surrounding La Pérouse's fate was, in many ways, a deliberate silence, born of national trauma and the rewriting of history. By the time d'Entrecasteaux set sail in search of his compatriots, he faced not only the immensity of the Pacific, but also the indifference of a nation that had dramatically turned the page of its history. The most poignant connection between the lost expedition and the fate of the French monarchy manifested in the final days of Louis XVI. Confined in the Temple prison with his family, the dethroned monarch maintained a routine that included reading, prayer, and conversations with his guards. According to multiple accounts collected by historians, including the memoirs of his sister Madame Elisabeth, Louis XVI regularly asked whether any news had arrived about La Pérouse. This obsession of the imprisoned king with the fate of his favoured expedition represents one of the most poetically tragic moments in French history. The man who had personally authorized and financed the mission, who had drafted its scientific and humanist instructions, who had followed its progress through periodic reports, now found himself imprisoned by the very Enlightenment ideals he had sought to promote through the expedition. The question, "Is there any news of La Pérouse?" echoed in his cell like a reverberation of a disappearing world, the world of enlightened absolutism, where kings could sponsor science and exploration as manifestations of benevolent power. The revolutionaries guarding the king likely considered this concern a sign of his detachment from the reality of France, but in truth, it encapsulated the tragedy of the entire Enlightenment project under the monarchy. Louis XVI had genuinely believed in the values of reason, science, and progress, yet these very values, radicalized, were now destroying his world. The La Pérouse expedition represented the last pure expression of those ideals before they were overtaken by revolutionary violence. When the king was taken to the scaffold on January 21, 1793, the expedition he had sponsored had been missing for nearly 5 years. There is no record that he mentioned La Pérouse in his final hours, yet the symbolic connection was undeniable. Both the king and his expedition were victims of the same historical cataclysm. The monarchy that had sent La Pérouse into the Pacific no longer existed, and the republic that replaced it had very different priorities. This personal link between the monarch's fate and that of the expedition partly explains why the search for La Pérouse was so fraught. Many naval officers who might have advocated for a more vigorous rescue mission had emigrated or been purged. The scientists still interested in the expedition's fate lacked political influence under the new regime. La Pérouse became a collateral victim of the revolution, not because the revolutionaries actively despised him, but because his fate was inextricably tied to a regime now deemed illegitimate. The condemned king's question would resonate across decades as a reminder of how great human endeavours can become ensnared in the historical upheavals they themselves helped set in motion. The La Pérouse expedition had departed as a symbol of royal power and ended as the ghost of a vanished world. The rescue expedition commanded by Bruni d'Entrecasteaux, which set sail in 1791, represented the last real opportunity to find survivors of the La Pérouse expedition. Equipped with 2 frigates, La Recherche and L'Espérance, d'Entrecasteaux was instructed to search all the islands of the South Pacific where the French ships might have wrecked. The mission was well funded and included its own scientific team, including the botanist Jacques-Julien Houtou de la Billardière and the hydrographer Charles-François Beautemps-Beaupré. For 2 years, d'Entrecasteaux conducted one of the most thorough searches in the history of navigation, meticulously charting the coasts of Tasmania, New Caledonia, the Solomon Islands, and the Vanuatu archipelago. The expedition's journals reveal a growing obsession with finding their lost compatriots. On each island, the French questioned the natives, showing them European objects and asking about white men. On several occasions, they received ambiguous reports that kept their hopes alive. In the Santa Cruz Islands, natives mentioned seeing ships like houses years earlier, but could not provide concrete details. The most frustrating moment came when d'Entrecasteaux passed just 70 kilometers from Vanikoro, the island where La Pérouse's remains lay, but chose not to explore it due to conflicting reports of dangerous reefs and hostile inhabitants. This decision, understandable given the limitations of 18th century navigation, doomed the mission to failure. To make matters worse, the rescue expedition itself was affected by political events in France. When war broke out between France and several European monarchies in 1793, d'Entrecasteaux found himself in a difficult position. As a Royal Navy officer, it was challenging to serve a revolutionary regime that had executed his king. The expedition unravelled due to internal disputes between Royalists and Republicans, and d'Entrecasteaux died of scurvy in July 1793 near New Guinea. His ships were captured by the Dutch in Java, and many of the expedition's documents were lost or confiscated. D'Entrecasteaux's failure sealed La Pérouse's fate in the popular imagination. For the next 30 years, the expedition became legend, appearing in novels, plays, and folk songs. Speculation arose that La Pérouse had discovered a secret passage through Australia, established a French kingdom on a remote island, or been captured by pirates or a rival European power. The lack of concrete evidence fueled the most fantastic theories, transforming a naval tragedy into a romantic myth. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the remains of La Boussole and l'Astrolabe lay in the reefs of Vanikoro, slowly covered by coral and sediment, waiting for someone to decipher the right clues. The mystery of La Pérouse had become the holy grail of Pacific exploration, a puzzle that would attract adventurers, treasure hunters and scientists for the next 4 decades. Until an Irish captain with an eye for detail followed the correct trail. Sometimes the answers are closer than we think. How many historical mysteries do you believe are waiting to be solved in places we have repeatedly overlooked? In the year 1826, the mystery of La Pérouse reached a turning point, thanks to the curiosity and insight of an Irish merchant captain named Peter Dillon. While trading on the island of Tikopia, in what is now the Solomon Islands, Dillon noticed something extraordinary. Several natives possessed objects of unmistakable European manufacture that did not correspond to the technology available for ordinary trade. What caught his attention in particular was a silver sword with a distinctive hilt, immediately recognizable as French, along with bells, spoons, and other high-quality metal utensils. When he questioned the owners about the origin of these artifacts, the islanders told a fascinating story. They recounted that years earlier, 2 large ships had been wrecked on an island called Vanikoro, several days' canoe journey away. According to their account, some of the crew had survived the wreck and lived on the island for a time, building a small boat from the remains of their ships to attempt an escape. Understanding the potential significance of this information, Dillon immediately travelled to Calcutta to present his findings to the British authorities. He convinced the Governor-General of India to fund a verification expedition, and in January 1827, he returned to Vanikoro aboard the ship Research. What he found confirmed all his suspicions. In the reef surrounding the island lay indisputable remains of 18th century European shipwrecks. The inhabitants of Vanikoro showed Dillon and his team several locations where artifacts could be found: copper fishhooks, iron nails, bronze fittings, and most significantly, several iron cannons matching the typical armament of French frigates of the period. The elders of the island shared with Dillon the oral tradition passed down through generations. They described how 2 floating houses had arrived on the island during a great storm, smashing against the reefs. Some of the white men had made it to shore, where they built a smaller vessel from the remains of their ships. After several months, the survivors sailed north, promising to return, but were never heard from again. Dillon meticulously collected all the artifacts he could recover, including a bronze bell with inscriptions in French, cannonballs stamped with the seal of the French Royal Navy, and several corroded but recognizable navigational instruments. His discovery caused a sensation in Europe when he returned to France in 1828, where he was celebrated as a hero and awarded a lifetime pension by King Charles X. The mystery of La Pérouse had been solved in its essential aspect. The location of the wrecks was now known, and it was confirmed that at least some of the crew had initially survived. Yet Dillon's discovery raised new and equally fascinating questions. How long had the French survived on Vanikoro? What had become of those who attempted to escape in the improvised boat? And perhaps most importantly, where were the journals and scientific documents that La Pérouse had undoubtedly tried to preserve? Dillon's work transformed the search for La Pérouse from a question of location into a historical forensic puzzle that would require the tools of modern archaeology to fully unravel. The definitive confirmation of La Pérouse's fate would come in the 21st century, thanks to the Franco-Australian archaeological expeditions that began in 2005. Using cutting-edge technology, these interdisciplinary teams accomplished what D'Entrecasteaux and Dillon could not: a complete and scientific documentation of the remains on Vanikoro. The 2005 expedition, led by underwater archaeologist Jean-Christophe Galipeau, employed side-scan sonar and magnetometers to systematically map the seafloor around the island. What they discovered was revelatory. Not one, but two separate shipwreck sites several hundred meters apart, confirming the native accounts that both frigates had suffered similar but not identical fates. At the site designated Wreck A, identified as La Boussole, archaeologists found the hull almost completely disintegrated, but with a significant concentration of artifacts, including musket balls, bronze fittings, and fragments of Chinese porcelain matching the known tableware of the expedition. Wreck B, likely L'astrolabe, displayed a different dispersion pattern, suggesting it had struck the reef more violently. Here they recovered several iron cannons, anchors, and, most excitingly, scientific instruments, including parts of a telescope and a fragment of a precision clock. Subsequent expeditions in 2008 and 2019 employed more advanced techniques, including underwater photogrammetry to create detailed 3D models of the sites. These models revealed dispersion patterns that allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the dynamics of the wrecks. Both frigates had been driven onto the reefs during a storm, with La Boussole striking first and L'Astrolabe following shortly after. Sediment analysis and coral growth on the artifacts provided more precise dating, confirming that the shipwrecks occurred around 1788 to 1789. Perhaps the most poignant discoveries came from terrestrial excavations. On the beach adjacent to the wrecks, archaeologists uncovered what they called the survivors' camp, evidence of fire pits, remnants of improvised tools, and fragments of glass that had been repurposed as cutting implements. Analysis of these remains showed that the French had managed to salvage a significant amount of equipment from their ships and had established an organized settlement that lasted several months, possibly up to a year. In 2003, prior to these large-scale expeditions, a particularly significant finding emerged: the positive identification of the remains of at least one crew member through DNA analysis. This discovery, conducted in collaboration with the Paris Museum of Natural History, provided the forensic closure that the families of the missing had awaited for centuries. Recent expeditions up to 2023 have continued to reveal new details using technologies such as underwater laser scanning and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. Every recovered artifact, from medical instruments to French coins, has helped reconstruct not only the final moments of the expedition, but also the struggle for survival that followed the wreck. Forensic archaeology has transformed La Pérouse from a legend into a tangible human story, revealing both the fragility of 18th century exploratory ventures and the incredible resilience of those who survived the initial disaster. The archaeological evidence on Vanikoro tells a story far more complex and tragic than a simple shipwreck. It reveals a prolonged drama of survival against the odds. Findings in the terrestrial camp, combined with the oral tradition of Vanikoro's inhabitants, suggest that a significant number of the 225 crew members survived the initial impact and waged a desperate battle for life that may have extended for months or even years. Excavations have uncovered multiple areas of activity on Vanikoro's main beach. Smelting sites where the French melted metal from the wreckage to fashion tools and weapons, improvised ovens for food processing, and evidence of temporary structures that provided shelter. The recovered artifacts tell a story of ingenuity and adaptation. Nails transformed into fishhooks, fragments of sails repurposed as awnings, and pieces of bronze turned into cooking utensils. Accounts recorded by Dillon and later by other visitors describe how the French built a smaller vessel using wood from their destroyed frigates. This endeavour, which must have consumed weeks or months of intensive labour, demonstrates a remarkable level of organisation and hope given the circumstances. Vanikoro's oral tradition suggests that when this vessel finally set sail, it carried several dozen survivors attempting to reach a known European trade route. The fate of this group remains one of the last unresolved mysteries of the expedition. For those who remained behind, whether by choice or because the vessel could not accommodate all, the situation likely became progressively desperate. Archaeological evidence shows the camp was gradually abandoned, with no signs of violence or mass death, suggesting that the last survivors may have been absorbed by the local population or succumbed to disease or malnutrition. Analysis of skeletal remains found in the area indicates that at least some of the French lived long enough to endure chronic conditions such as dental infections and healed fractures. One of the most poignant aspects of this prolonged tragedy is the evidence that the survivors maintained certain cultural and scientific practices until the end. Remains of writing instruments have been found, suggesting that someone continued keeping records. Fragments of scientific equipment, including parts of telescopes and compasses, indicate that they did not entirely abandon their identity as men of science. This persistence in documentation, even in the face of desperate circumstances, speaks to the deep commitment of La Pérouse and his men to their scientific mission. The true tragedy of Vanikoro was not only the death of 225 men, but the loss of the knowledge they had accumulated during their years of exploration. Had the survivors managed to preserve and eventually transmit La Pérouse's final journals and maps, the course of Pacific cartography could have been very different. Instead, what remains is the silent testimony of the artifacts, tools that speak of ingenuity, weapons that speak of defense, and fragments of scientific equipment that speak of an intellectual mission abruptly interrupted. Survival on Vanikoro thus represents a double tragedy, not only the loss of human lives, but the premature silencing of one of the most ambitious scientific enterprises of the 18th century. Despite the extraordinary advances in the investigation of La Pérouse's shipwreck, several fundamental mysteries persist, keeping fascination with this story alive more than 2 centuries later. The most enduring enigma concerns the fate of the survivors who left Vanikoro in the improvised vessel. The island's oral traditions, first recorded by Dillon and later verified by anthropologists, consistently describe a significant group, estimated between 30 and 50 men, setting sail to the north in a boat constructed from the remains of the frigates. The questions that have puzzled researchers for generations are: where were they heading? Which route did they take? And did they survive the initial voyage? Hypotheses vary widely. Some scholars suggest they attempted to reach the British colony at Botany Bay, approximately 2,000 kilometers to the south, although this theory seems unlikely given their northerly departure. Others propose their destination was the Spanish colony in Manila, nearly 5,000 kilometers away, an almost impossible journey in an improvised vessel. A third theory suggests they sought the French trading routes near the Mariana Islands. Modern searches have investigated numerous islands within a 1,000-kilometer radius of Vanikoro, but so far no conclusive traces of this group have been found. The second major mystery concerns the whereabouts of La Pérouse's final journals and the scientific records accumulated after leaving Botany Bay. From the documents he sent from Australia, we know La Pérouse was meticulous in his record-keeping and fully understood the historical and scientific value of his observations. It is inconceivable that he did not attempt to preserve these records during the shipwreck and the subsequent struggle for survival. Archaeological expeditions have systematically searched for airtight containers or boxes that could have held documents, but without success. It remains possible that the survivors carried these records with them in the vessel that left Vanikoro, or hid them somewhere on the island that has yet to be discovered. A third mystery centers on the relationship between the French survivors and the indigenous inhabitants of Vanikoro. Oral traditions collected in the 19th century describe both violent conflicts and periods of peaceful coexistence. Some accounts even suggest that a small number of French may have been absorbed into the local community and had descendants. Modern DNA testing of Vanikoro's population could potentially resolve this enigma, but comprehensive studies have not yet been conducted for ethical and logistical reasons. Finally, the mystery persists as to why the frigates came so close to Vanikoro's treacherous reefs. Retrospective meteorological analyses suggest there may have been a severe storm in the region around the estimated time of the shipwreck, but this does not fully explain why two ships commanded by experienced navigators found themselves in such dangerous waters. Was it a navigational error, a miscalculation of position, or a deliberate decision to seek shelter that went catastrophically wrong? Each new expedition to Vanikoro brings the hope of resolving some of these lingering mysteries. What began as the search for a shipwreck has evolved into a forensic investigation of one of the most fascinating episodes in the history of exploration. A reminder that even in the age of satellite technology and instant communication, the ocean still holds secrets waiting patiently to be discovered. The shipwreck of La Pérouse represents far more than a mere naval tragedy. It encapsulates the transition between two historical eras and leaves a complex legacy that resonates to this day. On a scientific level, the expedition, despite its tragic end, made significant contributions to European knowledge of the Pacific. The documents La Pérouse sent from Botany Bay and earlier, those carried by de Lesseps across Siberia, contained cartographic, ethnographic, and natural observations that greatly expanded the horizons of contemporary science. The Atlas du Voyage de La Pérouse, published posthumously in 1797, became an essential reference work for navigators for decades. On a geopolitical level, the disappearance of the expedition had profound consequences for the French presence in the Pacific. With the loss of its two best exploration ships and an entire generation of naval scientists, France's ability to compete with Great Britain in the cartography and colonization of the South Pacific was severely limited. This vacuum facilitated British expansion in Australia and New Zealand, shaping patterns of influence that would persist into the 20th century. Culturally, the story of La Pérouse has become a powerful symbol of the fragility of human ambition in the face of nature's forces. It has inspired countless literary works, from the early romantic novels of the 19th century to philosophical treatises on the relationship between man and the sea. His figure embodies the noblest ideals of the Enlightenment: the pursuit of scientific curiosity, respect for other cultures, and belief in progress, while simultaneously illustrating their limits when confronted with relentless physical realities. In the field of maritime archaeology, the La Pérouse shipwreck marked a fundamental milestone. It was one of the first cases in which modern scientific methods were applied to the investigation of a historical wreck, setting standards for the preservation and study of underwater cultural heritage. The techniques developed at Vanikoro have been adopted in investigations of other famous shipwrecks around the world. Today, La Pérouse's legacy remains alive through memorials in France and at the locations he visited, from Alaska to Australia. Vanikoro itself has become a site of pilgrimage for historians and exploration enthusiasts. Maritime museums worldwide display artifacts recovered from the wreck, each telling a small part of this epic story. Yet perhaps the most important legacy is the enduring lesson about the precarious intersection of human ambition and physical limits. La Pérouse's expedition represents the pinnacle of 18th century scientific exploration, an endeavor that combined physical courage with intellectual curiosity at its highest degree. Its tragic end reminds us that knowledge, however systematically pursued, is always subject to the whims of nature and the contingencies of history. 235 years after its disappearance, La Pérouse and his men continue to teach us valuable lessons about human resilience, the importance of preserving knowledge, and the humility we must maintain in the face of the vast natural world. This story, like so many others we explore, reminds us that the past is full of mysteries waiting to be solved. If you want to join us in uncovering them, subscribe to Chronicles Insolitas. For you it is a click. For us, it is the momentum that allows us to continue investigating and sharing these fascinating stories with you.